So welcome to our panel. A little bit about ourselves first. My name is Daniel Greenberg. I'm an adjunct professor of computer game design at George Mason University. I'm also the founder of Winterion Game Studios, based here in the DC area. We produce Let's Plays and then academic panels such as this one that we bring to conventions kind of up and down the Eastern Seaboard. And you can find me online at Twitter at Winterion or our site at winterion.com.
I'm Alex Greenberg. I work at Bethesda Game Studios here in Maryland, and I also perform as a singer and actor in the area. So that's where you'll find me on Twitter at GalaxQuest, as long as Twitter is around.
And a quick disclaimer, because it's a pirate panel. We need to note that the images and topics in the panels may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Also, a little bit about what this talk is, because we say the word pirate, it can mean lots of different things. We're not going to be talking about any piracy outside of the Caribbean, so this means no Sinbad, no Barbarossa Brothers, no Xing Shi, no Francis Drake, even no Henry Avery. We also won't be covering every pirate there.
Right. We won't be covering every Golden Age pirate, so with apologies to icons like Black Sam Bellamy or Black Bart, we'll have to talk about you later. We're also not covering sci-fi pirates, space pirates, or high fantasy pirates. And we definitely aren't covering pirating games or software, which we know none of you do. With that, I guess we'll get started.
All right. Let's dive into lore a little bit. So news of pirate activity from across the waters would have been thrilling to readers back home in Europe, and sort of the sensational news headlines are what kick off the initial excitement, or sort of the narrative thrill of piracy, as it were. Real-life tales of adventure set in tropical lands against indigenous tribes and opposing nations would have been the talk of everybody's dinner table. More importantly, the notion of building a crew based on egalitarian principles, or even pirate republics like the sort of the infamous / not really real Libertalia, create an image in the minds of people in Europe that this is something that is sort of fantastical, but it's also very anti-imperial, and something about that sentiment is very threatening to a lot of the established powers in the Age of Sail, who are very much going on about as strong a colonial kick as they possibly could at the time.
So like in England and the home countries that pirating was taking place, they would print the entire trials, and they provide detailed drawings of the hangings that would add fuel to the fire, that people would come out like, oh, okay, they're bringing a pirate from the Caribbean here to be hanged, so let's all go, and we'll bring our family, and we'll all buy these hanging marionettes and dolls and drawings. And it was like a big, the city would take to the streets to witness this big party of the hanging of pirates that were, doing bad things.
Pirate merch tables.
Woo!
And before sea shanties became popular and started having panels here at MAGFest, it was actually ballads that did a lot of the spreading of this. They were extremely cheap to print. You could get them for less than a penny. They were on one side, single sheet of paper, and they were an effective way to sort of communicate these stories. So much so that pirates themselves actually got into the habit of writing their own ballads, right? If you can be your own storyteller, you can kind of be your own hype guy. So they were producing these works, and they were being sung in the taverns, and they were kind of furthering the propagation, especially in the lower classes, of a lot of these sort of these high tales of adventure on the open seas.
And meanwhile, the high society was being introduced by piracy by getting these stories of kind of pirates as Robin Hood characters within the plays that they were watching, or the operettas. There was one called The Successful Pirate, which was staged at the Theatre Royale, and it glamorized pirate lifestyle. And people went to the theater and they were kind of like, well, how do I do this? Stories like this would go on to influence books, movies, and television, and they'd captivate imaginations centuries later.
Including authors. So it takes us into the literature of piracy. The first name that will come up when you search this topic is almost certainly Daniel Defoe. He's called a pirate novelist. He's best known for Robinson Crusoe, but at the height of his attribution, he was assumed to have written somewhere in the realm of 500 texts on various true, semi-true, and totally fictional pirate accounts. As it is, modern historians are kind of scaling that number back. They feel like they attributed a little too much of the writing back then to him. But one of the big books that he was previously thought to have written is the book that really kind of codified the first impression that media creators had of pirates, and that was A General History of the Pirates by Captain Charles Johnson. Now, Captain Charles Johnson is a pseudonym. That's the name of the actual playwright who wrote The Successful Pirate, and no one really knew who wrote this book. It was assumed after Wilde v. Defoe, but now there's conflicting accounts, and we're kind of back to wondering. But the book is a big deal. It's a compendium that kind of catalogs most, not all, but most of the big names during the golden age of piracy. It tells about their lives. Historical accounts can tell now that a lot of it is embellished. Like for every true statement in Pirates, there might be like 1 to 2 fake statements kind of built in to further kind of propagate the legend of these characters. And they do get twisted to kind of feed Captain Johnson's narrative that he's writing in the book. But it really is the anchor from which all of this literature starts going. It's a huge inspiration for pirate storytelling. It's just as mixed usefulness as a historical resource, but it's really great to use as a resource for like where did people come up with their pirate ideas, including some additional stories that we've got up here.
The first that we're going to talk about is Treasure Island. And if you don't know the story of Treasure Island, it's about young Jim Hawkins who boards the ship, the Hispaniola, and they're finding the buried treasure of Captain Flint, and the ship cook, the peg-leg pirate Long John Silver with a parrot on his shoulder, plots a mutiny to steal it and kill the unsuspecting crew. It popularizes a lot of pirating tropes that we know of today, like the parrot, peg legs, and phrases like X marks the spot, shiver me timbers. So the success of the book spawned numerous novels and film adaptations and stage plays and the Muppet movie, and that we all know and love. And then my favorite is Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. Was first a play and then a novel, and it tells the story of Wendy and her siblings John and Michael and their adventures in Neverland with Peter, whose big bad is this fantasy pirate Captain Hook. And it could be said that he's based off of real pirates, the one that people know nowadays from the TV show, The Gentleman Pirate, Stede Bonnet. But this story contrasts childhood and adulthood while telling the tale of a flying boy dueling a vengeful captain aboard a ship called the Jolly Roger. And then, like Treasure Island, Peter Pan's success has made it a popular choice for books, movies, and shows. And Captain Hook is one of the best known pirates I know of.
I think my favorite Peter Pan little anecdote that we found while researching this was that there weren't originally, the pirates weren't in the original story. Mm-hmm. And after a while, Jim Barrie was like, well, kids really like pirates. And they like put them in there, and it completely changed. Like Peter Pan went from being the antagonist to like this sort of lovable rogue protagonist, and it really changed the story.
Right, it became the embodiment of youthfulness versus somebody who's lived through life and become jaded, and that became the pirate feeling.
Some other books, especially one of the newer ones, On Stranger Tides by Tim Powers, marries the romance of the high seas with the supernatural. Tells the story of a Frenchman traveling to the New World, only for the ship that he's booked passage on to be taken over by pirates. He and an English woman get swept up in this adventure involving like the stealing of life and skeletons on ships, the Fountain of Youth, Vodun magic, Ponce de Leon. So it's a kind of a big, sweeping, epic, supernatural pirate story. It was a huge inspiration for a number of things, including the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, The Secret of Monkey Island, and other such sort of fantastical, supernatural pirate stories. But if you're looking for hard historical information on pirates, of all the books we looked at, I recommend The Republic of Pirates by Colin Woodard. He did diligent research. He's got a lot of accounts, a lot of kind of hard facts that he went and found, especially in the Carolinas. And his accounts of the captains are every bit as compelling as the fictional stories. So I promise you, the stories of all the things that happened to these guys in the 16 and 1700s.
Just because it's true doesn't mean it's boring.
Right. And then one last text I want to mention here. There's a really well-researched book that kind of covers an underrepresented topic on this, and that's Laura Suk Duncombe's Pirate Women. It gives really tremendous accounts, a lot of sort of the fearsome ladies that terrorize the seas as well, with both famous names like Mary Read and Anne Bonny, and then some lesser-known pirates that operated in many different theaters, from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea to the Caribbean, and all their sort of successes and failures. But it's a really well-researched account of kind of an undercovered portion of this period in history. Should also note, Xing Shi, #1 most successful pirate of all time.
And I like this book too because it also talks about how pirate women are represented in novels, are represented in movies, I just think that it was like a very important chapter in this book.
But as we said, we're going to cover a very specific era, so let's dive in.
Speaking of movies.
Yeah, let's dive in.
Caves and tavern halls, we live by no man's rules. Fly the colors of the living, free and proud and true. We set out on the ocean blue to escape tyranny. We keep our merry hearts alive so long we roam the sea. A man once walked along the shore and called he out to me, I see you are a fisherman, a lover of the sea. I know this world's a wretched place, but if you'll follow me, I'll take all of your burdens, and pirates we shall be.
So let's make our way to the Golden Age.
All right. So the Golden Age is really broken up into 3 periods. So there's one that most people think of as the Golden Age. The first period is the Buccaneer period from 1650 to 1680s. And this was primarily where French settlers came to Tortuga, which is modern-day Haiti, and they lived off the wildlife. That term comes from the French term
Boucanier?
Meaning the preparation of dried meat. And these hunters were employed by other countries to attack Spanish colonizers. And then after that, pirate round from 1690 to 1700s was the term for the sailing route followed by the pirates from the New World around the Atlantic to Madagascar towards India. And it declined in popularity when merchant ships kind of got smarter and traveled with escorts for protection, and once more lucrative privateering opportunities came after the start of the war.
And the final period is sometimes referred to as the true Golden Age, which is from 1713 to the 1720s, the post-war era. You might notice we skip a window there. And that window is the War of Spanish Succession. And so what happens is in 1701 to about 1713, the major European powers, England, France, Spain, and the Dutch, who are the 4 major players in this region, are at war. And because they're at war, the governments of those countries, especially England, are offering letters of marque. They are giving authority to captains to attack other ships as long as they're not attacking their own nation's ship and they're doing it in the name of king and country and so forth. It gives them license to be privateers, legal pirates as it were. And those privateers looted and plundered and got really good at what they did. And then the war ended. And you had a bunch of people who are really good at plundering and piracy and no legal framework to do it, but there's still really big, juicy ships all over the place, and they didn't really have the idea of armed escorts and modern naval tactics to deal with this. They're like, oh, we'll just send our merchant ships out, and they'll just keep looting the colonies and doing their triangular trade routes, and everything will be peachy keen. And all of a sudden, the pirates are like, well, we're just going to keep raiding. And so the sort of the golden age of piracy is when the pirates decide they don't care that the war is over, they're just going to keep looting, and not only do they keep looting, they start looting their own country's ships as well. So where did the Golden Age take place? We've got a little map here kind of explaining this. Most of the action took place in the New World, and this is specifically the waters of the trade routes from Africa to the Caribbean. So that trade route we were talking about, you would have slave ships going from Africa to the New World. They would then be exchanging for especially sugar in the Caribbean, but sugar, tobacco, rum, and other supplies from the Caribbean and the colonies, then taking that back to Europe where it was very lucrative to sell, and then taking their profits, keeping a lot of them there, and then turning some of them into things like guns and other trade goods that they would then bring back down to Africa and repeat the process. So there was sort of this juicy window there in the Caribbean for a lot of these ships to get raided. So pirates operated, therefore, it's an area that spans sort of just a range here. The raids happened as far north as like North Carolina, and then as far south as the northern coast of South America.
Right. And then havens started to pop up, and they were in Tortuga, Port Royal, and the Pirate Republic of Nassau were the main bases of operations for business of piracy, which included bars, inns, and brothels. And these were governed under like an informal pirate code, which is based off of the pirate code that ships had on their that the ships made amongst their crew. They would have an Articles of Agreement, and they would kind of like nail it up next to the captain's quarters. And a lot of times we don't have these records to know which captain had which articles, because when that ship got raided, they would rip up the Articles of Agreement and light it on fire as a protest, or like throw it into the ocean, like, you don't know what our ship stood for. But we do have some records, and some of them are in Charles Johnson's book. So they included things like all members of the crew had a right to vote. They had a right to the portion of the treasure, equal shares of the ship's provisions. There was rules about maintaining your weapons, keeping the deck clean, and on resolving interpersonal issues, which included no fighting on the deck, but when we get to the shore, you can have a duel.
And this lasted until about 1718. An important figure arrives on the scene, Captain Woodes Rogers. And Rogers is basically responsible for breaking the stranglehold that the pirates have in the Caribbean. His first act is actually kind of brilliant. He convinces the King of England to create this pardon. And the pardon says, you can keep whatever you've looted as long as you agree to just stop now. And a lot of people in England, especially the lords, are like, well, this is crazy. You're letting them off the hook. They killed so many people. They did all these awful things. But Woodes Rogers realized that, a lot of these pirates had no way out. They had no retirement plan, right? And so you could shut this whole thing down, or certainly break the backs of a lot of these captains if you just told all their crew, like, hey, we know what you did, and this is your off-ramp. You can quit now and go be a family man, and everything will be fine. And a lot of them did, and you started to see that the factions kind of split off at that point. Those who did, he actually went a step farther and commissioned some of them to be pirate hunters and got them to turn on their former comrades and chase their ships down. And by the 1720s, the few pirates that were still operating were definitely scattered, and a lot of the pirate strongholds, especially Nassau, which was one time known as the Republic of Pirates, Woodes Rogers had moved in, installed himself as governor, and basically restored trade and order to what would eventually become the Bahamas. So
the first pirate that we found that kind of fit this mold of what we're talking about, privateer to pirate hunter, actually, is Benjamin Hornigold. And he's one of the most famous figures of this period. But he never actually considered himself a pirate. He kind of was like, my crew are pirates, but I'm not going to govern them that way. After the war ended, he turned to piracy because his crew voted to do that. But in his heyday, he sailed with notorious pirates such as Blackbeard, Black Sam Bellamy. His captaining style was unique in that he never wanted his crew to hurt anyone, well, never wanted them to kill anyone, and he wanted to attack merchant ships as long as they weren't English or England's ally, the Dutch. So there's the story that he once raided a ship and he only took their hats because the night before his crew had gotten drunk and thrown their hats overboard, and that's all they wanted from that ship. They didn't take any loot, they just took their hats and left. But Hornigold sailed the Caribbean and North American coast, and his most successful capture was the French ship the Concorde, which Blackbeard later takes and becomes the Queen Anne's Revenge.
But his most lasting legacy, Hornigold, more than any of these other guys, his real triumph is on land. It's not on the sea. He calls himself the protector of Nassau. And he is the main figure that helps create the flying gang and what becomes the Republic of Pirates in Nassau. So for a few years, Nassau is operating basically as like a pirate colony. Pirates are safe to land there. They're, all of the looting and activities. It's sort of a harbor for all those pirates to use as base of operations. And he rules the island the same way that the pirates rule their ships. It's a very egalitarian society. It's a lot of voting on things. And that works to his advantage for a while and eventually his disadvantage. So when Rogers arrives in Nassau in 1718, again, Hornigold doesn't see himself as a pirate. He sees himself as someone who's he's bringing some order and respectability to this chaos, but he still serves king and country. So he does accept the king's pardon, and he convinces a lot of other pirates to do the same. And then Rogers goes, well, you talk a big game, but, put up or shut up in nautical terms. He sends Rogers sends Hornigold out to chase down some of the most notorious pirate leaders that are refusing the king's pardon or still operating in the waters of the Caribbean. With his assistance, Rogers creates this new motto of Expulsis Piratus Restituta Commercia, or Pirates Expelled, Commerce Restored.
Really rolls off the tongue.
Yeah, which you can still see emblazoned, I think, on the seal of the Bahamas to this day. Still has Woodes Rogers' original proclamation. He was sent to go after somebody we're going to talk about here in a second, Charles Vane. And while he doesn't get to Charles Vane in time, but something else happens to Charles Vane, we don't really know what happens to Benjamin Hornigold. He's thought maybe to have crashed on a reef and died at sea, but he disappears at some point in the 1720s, and there's no sort of accurate historical record of what happens beyond then.
Charles Vane. So this is your typical awful, awful pirate. As a boy, Charles Vane watched the public execution of Captain William Kidd, and that really shaped his mindset. It left a mark on his memory, and he considered Kidd a hero who fought for the poorer classes and against oppressors. So when he first was contracted as a privateer, he was supposed to attack the Spanish vessels that collected gold from a sunken fleet off the coast of Florida. And the sunken fleet had $450 million in today's money worth of gold and gems on that ship. So all of these privateers and pirates came to collect, and instead of going to collect the gold from the ship itself, they attacked the ships that were coming back from that. So I guess it was kind of a smart plan. So his first recorded act of actual piracy, though, was the raid of a Spanish camp that had some of this recovered treasure. It was after the war had ended, so the aggressive act was not considered under the letter of marque. It was just something that they had done, outside of what they were allowed to do. So the Spanish soldiers were forced to retreat, and leaders of the group that they were doing this raid with, which included Hornigold, Black Sam Bellamy, they did not condone any act of violence. So if Charles Vane had been running this raid, they probably would have killed all the Spanish. They were outnumbering them 300 men to 60. But luckily, he was not in charge then.
Vane would eventually have some level of command. He became captain of a small fleet, and he would man the crew that was probably the single biggest opposition to Hornigold's acceptance of the pardon and the general idea of sort of retiring piracy. He was thrown in prison in Nassau at one point because he was considered an enemy of the state, and he wasn't accepting the king's pardon, so they were going to try him for his original piratical crimes. Hornigold convinces him to take it to save face, and he does, but he immediately spits on it afterwards. To escape the blockade of Nassau Harbor, he boards a few ships, including his own flagship, which he then sets on fire and sails directly at the blockade. So pirate ship, all ships at this time, really flammable. So if you see like a flaming, it wasn't a ship at the line, but it was a really large ship, coming at them, they had no choice but to move, to break that blockade to get out of the way because they didn't want to lose a bunch of Navy ships. So he follows that burning ship out of the harbor, and they actually escape the blockade of Nassau. And he and his crew go on to commit some additional piracy in the Caribbean. And while they're out there doing that, once he escapes this blockade, he becomes extremely violent and bitter and really just a psychotic individual. He's cruel to his own men. He's torturing everybody that they board. He was known to sail without a code, which allowed him to attack anything and everybody. They would torture people that they boarded, demanding to know where loot was, even if there wasn't loot on these ships.
And the thing about sailing without a code, so he could then, because he was captain, he would say like, well, I'm captain, so I'm going to keep most of the treasure for myself. So the crew wasn't getting part of, what they normally would keep as their spoils.
Right,
so.
Which is an important note. It's not just that he's awful to everybody else, he's awful to his own people too, and that does come back to bite him. After he refuses to attack a well-armed French warship, his crew decides to overthrow him for cowardice. It might have been a good decision, but it was an opportunity to mutiny, and I'm sure the crew was just looking for their best opportunity to do it. Turns out the guy who performs the mutiny is Calico Jack Rackham, another big name in this period. He goes from quartermaster to becoming captain. And then Vane and the few men that voted in his favor, I think it was 15 in total, get put into a rowboat and sent off on their way.
So they do a little bit, they're trying to rebuild their Vane fleet. And off the coast of Honduras, he's doing a little bit of piracy, and he encounters a hurricane that leaves behind only him and one other survivor. And they're stranded on an island, and they get picked up by another boat. And Vane boards this boat and uses a pseudonym. He's like, oh, I'm Captain John Smalls. And somebody on the boat recognizes him as Charles Vane. And they're like, oh, no, you're going to get hung. So they take him to Port Royal for trial, and then 2 years later, they take him out of prison and hang him. So his body was left in one of those things. So that on the left side here is actually William Kidd, and he was left there for like months in this gibbet on the shore, and that was the same fate that actually befell Charles Vane. So it was a very full circle story.
Next on our list is Anne Bonny. Born in Ireland as the illegitimate daughter of an attorney, William Cormac, and his maid, Peggy. When the affair was discovered, William's wife was given the family fortune, and that knowing his wife would never pay for the upbringing of his illegitimate daughter, William Cormac instead pretends that Anne Bonny is a male clerk that he's hired. Because the wife controls the purse strings, she's still very bitter about the whole thing, but he figures he can at least get money for his daughter if he pretends his daughter is just some boy that he hired and not an illegitimate kid. But once she discovers Anne's true identity, she cuts the family off entirely, and the maid, the husband, and the daughter Anne Bonny all move to the New World. At the age of 12, the maid passes away, and the accounts of Anne kind of taking over as the mistress of the father's plantation are very, very harsh. She exhibits violence towards the staff and even potential suitors. Instead of marrying any of the eligible bachelors that her father is trying to hook her up with, she sets off to sail with a guy named James Bonny, and is disowned by the rest of the family. And then the two of them head off to Nassau. While she's in Nassau, Anne Bonny falls in love with the aforementioned Calico Jack. And and as was a common custom during a time where divorce really wasn't prevalent, Jack offers to buy Anne out of the marriage. He wants to pay James Bonney for the rights to annul their marriage. And James refuses. And not only does he refuse, he huffs and stomps over to Woodes Rogers and says, "They're embarrassing me. They're making a mockery out of me. I want you to punish them." And so that forces Calico Jack and Anne to actually flee Nassau, because Woodes Rogers basically intends to whip and punish them for sort of embarrassing this plantation owner.
Yeah, so they turn to piracy again, and they have a very unusual crew. It's actually a very small crew. They usually had about 18 to 20 people, and that was it. And then following one of their captures, they hired on a sailor named Mark Reed, who was getting real buddy-buddy with Anne Bonny until Calico Jack got a little jealous, and then they revealed that Mark was actually Mary. And then they had a crew vote to see if they wanted to keep both Mary and Anne Bonny on the ship, because in those days it was unlucky to have women or children aboard the ship, and they decided to keep them both, which was good because they were actually really good at what they did, which this story represents. On the evening of their ship capture, the crew was all drinking and carousing, and when they realized that they were being boarded, they all went below deck, including Captain Calico Jack, and the only people to fight off the people boarding were Mary Reed and Anne Bonny and one other gentleman. So they were seized and tried in Jamaica, and Rackham was sentenced to be hanged, and Bonny said to him, "If you had fought like a man, you wouldn't be hanged like a dog." So, famous, good line. Bonny was granted a reprieve as she was pregnant. She pleaded her belly, and what was happened to her was unknown. Some people think that her rich father came back and took her out. Some people think she escaped. It kind of only adds to her mysterious appeal. And then as Laura Sook Duncombe states in her book, that women are violent, they're sexually liberated, they are women of color, they're queer women, they don't follow the rules, they don't apologize, and do not often get happy endings. But stories like Anne highlight the freedom that piracy represents, not just by breaking the laws, but the cultural boundaries and expectations of women at the time. So they're kind of important.
And this takes us to pretty obscure pirate.
Our last pirate, before we get to games.
Blackbeard. Most commonly known as Edward Teach or Edward Thatch. The pronunciations at the time aren't explicitly clear here. And while some sources also point to a last name of Drummond, not many pirates used their own name. A lot of them would use surnames intentionally because they didn't want to tarnish their family names or bring anybody else involved into it. So we may never really know his true identity. We believe he was literate, well-educated, likely came from a wealthy family. He took to the sea from a fairly early age. I think he was originally believed to come from Bristol, England, and was in his early 20s when he arrived in the Caribbean.
So he sailed with Hornigold and Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, and then when he had the Queen's Anne Revenge, he took his fleet south towards the West Indies. And he had 4 ships by then and over 250 men. He tore a path through the French territories there, and he burned the ships and the colony of Guadalupe before heading to the Gulf of Mexico. And there he became notorious for raiding the Spanish merchant ships, and he earned the name El Gran Diablo, the Great Devil. Blackbeard is known as one of the most fearsome pirates, but his use of intimidation, not violence, was his greatest weapon. He purposefully kept his personal history vague so he could conceal his identity and use multiple names, so people had all these stories about him, and he did not confirm or deny any of them. He lit cannon fuses within his beard and under his hat, so it would be when he would come out for battle, it would be like a smoky demon coming towards you. And he had his belt was lined with all of these flintlock pistols, which only gave off one shot. So he would just do one, and then one, and then one, and then he would get you with his cutlass.
Yeah. So Blackbeard's probably his biggest act of piracy isn't actually raiding a ship so much as it's raiding a town or a bunch of ships. He travels north to Charlestown, North Carolina, and blockades the harbor. He takes a lot of hostages until his demands are met. But his demands are a little unique. He's basically demanding that the town bringing him doctors and medicine. He and his crew needed treatment, including stores of mercury, which he needed to treat his own case of syphilis. He had at least 14 recorded wives, so it isn't too surprising that he contracted the disease, given his lifestyle. And it is believed that towards the end of his life that he was suffering from it and might have been affecting his mental condition as well. His ship did continue up the coast and eventually ran aground. It left most of his men stranded. He took a small skeleton crew of about 30 up to Bath, North Carolina, and surprisingly took the king's pardon, and then retired to a little island nearby.
For a little bit, and then he dipped out into the ocean just a little bit past where he was in the port there, and he attacked 2 merchant ships. And once they went down, he came back and said, "Oh, I just found these abandoned ships and this loot," and that was enough for the governor of Virginia to be like, okay, well, he's not going to stop pirating, so we're going to go after him. So he sent out Captain Maynard to bring him Blackbeard, dead or alive. And the final battle took place off the coast of North Carolina in the shallow waters. Maynard's ship ran aground. And they attempted to lighten the load of their cargo by throwing off all of the things, their cannons and anything that was heavy. And meanwhile, Blackbeard boarded their ship. And believing they had fired all of these shots and completely battered the whole top part of the ship with all of their ammo. Then they boarded the ship and they were like, okay, well, we probably killed everybody. And they started to loot. And while that happened, Maynard's crew came out and started attacking them. And it is believed that Blackbeard was said to have endured 20 stabs and 5 gunshot wounds before finally succumbing to his death. And his head was severed and tied to the bowsprit as a final declaration that Blackbeard was defeated. And a lot of people say that that was the end of piracy, really, that after Blackbeard.
There's such a symbolic end to that,
Right.
while additional incidents occurred beyond it, that was kind of like the literal and figurative figurehead.
Right. If Blackbeard could be killed, then.
Right. But this is MAGFest, so let's talk about some games.
Woo!
I don't recognize this guy.
So there have been a few, too many, but we're going to talk about 6 in particular and break them into 3 2-game segments, starting with historical games. And of course, when you think historical actually first, you immediately go to Assassin's Creed. We both agreed, I think, that we wish we had played this game after doing all the historical research, because it would have been really interesting to see, knowing going in. But I think it was also just as interesting for us playing this game first, then doing the research and going, oh, That's why they did that. In the fourth entry of the Assassin's Creed series, players experience the life of Edward Kenway, on the left there, through the Animus, which is a device that allows you to basically witness history through the DNA of your ancestors. It takes you back to the golden age of piracy, and you meet a number of key historical figures, including Blackbeard, Vane, Woodes Rogers, Bonnet, and others. And while the game is thorough in its use of names and places, it's very good about setting you there. The historical actually is not really as diligent as the series has gotten, and it has improved over time, especially as you get into games like Odyssey that have the Discovery Tour and actually provide a lot of historical context along with the sort of the fictional story they tell on top of it. Black Flag instead melds a lot of pirate lore into kind of fit its story of Templars and Assassins fighting throughout history. The biggest example of this might be Mary Read, who in the game poses as the illegitimate son of Captain Kidd, joins the Assassins, and is then kind of used as a moral compass to steer Kenway towards joining the fight. But that embellishment of historical truths, in a way, is also one of the game's strengths. Kenway is not a typical assassin. He doesn't fall in league with the organization. He's fairly heretical, and he's fairly independent. And in a lot of ways, the way he behaves kind of mimics that pirate ethos, or certainly the, I guess I would say, what is the glorified version of that pirate ethos. You can tell that a lot of the lines are lifted straight from ballads, journals, eyewitness reports, and their personal stories and the sort of the authentic dialogue that they have makes the game feel a little less lonely than other Assassin's Creed titles. Other AC titles are very much like, there's a lot of stealth, and it's a lot of, you are by yourself. And Black Flag is very good about taking a lot of the NPCs and involving you in their lives as well, in a way that does not make the game feel quite as lonely.
As far as like pirating mechanics go, this game is like really chock full of everything. The fighting takes on various forms. So you could be stealthy, like the typical Assassin's Creed way of like sneaking up on somebody and using those methods, but you can also have aggressive melee combat like swordplay and the use of flintlock pistols, which I mentioned earlier, which are very time appropriate but also really satisfying. The players also command a ship, which is called the Jackdaw, and they use it to sail around the West Indies, which is the correct location, and they effectively convey the freedom and the vastness of the region, and the catchy sea shanties, which are interesting too, because like a sea shanty was really meant so that the crew keeps time. So when you're doing something and you want to speed up the boat, you speed up the song. You pick a different song that's a little more peppy, and I think this kind of really, you got the flavor of that. It was like sea shanties with a purpose. And then the ship combat is also varied. There's different cannons, including swivel and side mounted, and there's boarding actions, and you can loot, and you can decide what to do with the ship and the crew that you attack. And there are various treasure hunting elements, so you can do traditional open world fetch quests, or you can do these mini games where you can dive using this diving bell and discover treasures and fight like sea monsters underneath the water, and take a small crew on a rowboat to pursue sharks and whales.
The next historical game we were going to cover is Sid Meier's Pirates. There are actually multiple releases of this. There's the original 1987 that came out on a bunch of different computer systems. There's the Gold Remaster in 1993 for the Genesis. And then there's the full HD remake in 2004. And that HD remake is the one we're going to cover here. This is basically a pirate life simulator. You choose to align with one of 4 nationalities, and you play the part of a young man who's trying to rescue his family members and undo kind of a great injustice that was done to them. He flees these captors of his family as a child. 10 years later, he decides to board the ship, and his main goal is he's going to become a successful pirate and get back his family. He gets the opportunity when the ship he hires on to sail to the New World mutinies, and he takes over as the captain, so the game drops you right in as the captain of a ship.
Oh, was that me?
Oh, yeah.
The game features real-life pirates. So there's a leaderboard that has names such as Captain Kidd and Calico Jack and Captain Morgan, but not all were appropriate for that specific time period. So it's a little fudgy, but their presence gives the player the thrill of climbing the leaderboard filled with familiar names that you're fighting. And then you can choose to either try and out-pirate them by sinking more ships or looting more treasure, or knock them out entirely by defeating them in battle.
You can either climb to the top of the leaderboard, or you can kill the leaderboard. The breadth of pirate activity in the game is very impressive. They really do let you do a lot in this. When you're at port, you can buy and sell various goods at region-specific pirates. So if you're the sort of person who enjoys an economic trading game, you realize you can buy spices in one place, sugar in another place, luxuries in another place, and you can flip them at inflated places at other ports, so you can really expand your treasure haul. You can upgrade your ships, outfit them with new gear. You can have multiple ships in your flotilla. The taverns offer you various intel. You can recruit additional pirates to your crew. The governors will offer you promotions and land in exchange for service to their various countries. You can also court the daughters of the governors of these various islands and dance with them. They'll provide you additional intel. You can even woo them to the point of marriage. You can discover map fragments that lead you to buried treasure or to family members that have been stowed away in jails scattered throughout the Caribbean. You can steal defeated vessels to add them to your flotilla. You can sink them. You can loot them. And of course, you can finally track down and defeat the evil Montalban for what he did to your family.
So, this one here, right? Okay. Because the game works as an open sandbox, there's lots of consequences. Days pass, crews grow restless, and they'll like mutiny and take a ship and leave if you're not doing enough to keep them happy. The game also assigns tasks and orders based on a map, so if you don't get to something in time, or you can't get there in time, you kind of are in the lurch. And as you age, the player's character slows down in like speed fighting or like things you can't do. So for example, the final duel, there's an odd juxtaposition where the best in-game strategy is to bum rush the final boss at the very beginning, and then you can start doing the career, because otherwise you're gonna be too old.
I know that feeling. Some other games, if you enjoy simulations like this, Age of Pirates, Caribbean Tales, in Tropico 2, and a newer game, Naval Action. Next, let's dig into a couple swashbuckling games, starting with Lego Pirates of the Caribbean.
So these are best described as pantomime. All the Lego games are kind of like this, where they act out a story without dialogue, and they cover various licensed properties until, you know, the fans are following along with what the movie gave you. For this game, you play through the first 4 movies of the franchise, and you put a more lighthearted spin of the adventures of Jack Sparrow. So, for example, when you first arrive in Port Royal, you see the gibbet of the hanging men, but it's not dead pirates, it's live, waving, happy pirates. So there's a little bit of like storytelling, how they change it for the Lego audience. There's some inherited advantages to this method. Without a lot of dialogue boxes, you can get right into the action, and there's no need to really localize the games for languages. It can have drawbacks as well, though, especially for those who haven't seen all of the movies. And you can really use some written guidance if you like leave the game and then come back to it later, and you're like, what was it that I needed to do? And the static camera can kind of make it hard to see what you need to do next.
Yeah. The primary pirating activities in this game are treasure hunting and sword fighting. To the first, Jack, you can see here, can see these little X's. He's got a special compass based on the stories that allows him to find items. So you'll wander around the map, open up the compass, locate additional Lego bricks, and you'll use those to build things or to progress in the story. The sword fighting part is fairly simple. It's a lot of button mashing, but if you're good at button mashing, it kind of builds in the parries and the attacks and damage to the enemies in a way that it's kind of fun and cinematic, but doesn't require much actual skill. Again, really great for the audience. The penalty for dying is also very, very low. You lose a little bit of the currency, and the currency only matters because you build it up over time to unlock a lot of the additional characters in the game or some of the additional features. So novice players can go through this just fine. It doesn't matter if you die 100 times to defeat a level, you still beat the level and move on. And then for more experienced players, you can try to collect the golden bricks, you can try to be a true pirate by getting a high score in a level and so forth, and then use the free play mode to take additional pirates with special abilities, like they can break silver blocks, or they can leash up to locations, or they have double jump, to get some of the hidden and accessible things. And that really expansive roster is good because it gives them the ability to not only let you play as your favorite characters, or choose like which pieces you want your own Lego minifig to have on them, but but to let a second player join in the action, because you can play LEGO Pirates of the Caribbean 2-player. And then Sea of Thieves. This is a sandbox pirating massive multiplayer adventure. Rare made this to allow players to indulge in a variety of swashbuckling activities with their friends, from pursuing ships on the high seas to taking requisitions for various trading companies for fun and profit. The later expansions have continued to add features, including AI ships of literal skeleton crews, and then small adventures. They started actually building a narrative into the game called Tall Tales, with plots such as A Pirate's Life, which did feature Jack Sparrow. That said, most of Sea of Thieves is experiential narrative. It's a lot of the stories you tell with your friends as you goof off, play the squeeze box on the top deck, go after random ships and raid them, or even go up to a ship and then just use voice chat to laugh and talk with them for a while. It's very much sort of an open, free sort of game.
Mm-hmm. During character creation, players can use the infinite pirate generator to find an avatar they want to use, and that's how they customize their look with the in-game features. You can also do this with your ship, kind of, so you can acquire or buy, unlock things for your sails, your figureheads, your cannon, your wheels. You can buy things for your ship cabin. So there are ways to customize the game and make it truly your own.
And this is definitely a game that is best experienced with friends, hearing voices, cooperating to take down opposing ships. Rare really leans in the multiplayer aspect with a lot of benefits for streamers who play this game, extra in-game rewards for people who play as teams, and having very active forums for discussion. You can even have some of the democratic pirate stuff, like your crew can hold a vote and you can throw a belligerent party member in the brig if they're not listening to you. If you enjoy these games, we also recommend stuff like Uncharted 4, A Thief's End, Pirates: The Legend of Black Cat, and then Dead Storm Pirates. And then let's talk about two narrative games real quick, starting with one that got a lot of cheers during that video, Return of the Obra Dinn. In 1807, a vessel called the Obra Dinn shows up at port with only the skeletons of its former crew aboard. As the Honorable East India Company's chief inspector, the player must board the ship and determine the fate of everyone aboard. To do this, you're given a ship manifest, artist renditions of the crew, and a magical pocket watch called the Memento Mortem, which allows you to witness the moment of a ship member's death. And while this is technically the sailing of a merchant ship, it's not a pirate ship. They suffer a lot of fates that are generally found in pirate tales. Attacks from fantastical beasts, violent storms, and a ship mutiny. There are moments of greed as passengers plot and scheme over the treasure aboard, and grief over the death of close friends from sickness, battles, or even accidents.
The mechanics in this game are really interesting. The story is already told, so it kind of unfurls from end to beginning. So you see different angles, you get to witness behaviors and pick up on clues, but you're not a character in the story, you're just getting to watch it as it unfurls for you. You see the simplicity is also mirrored in the art style, so there's a two-tone line art that reinforces the methodical textbook gameplay approach, which is really interesting. I really liked playing this.
Yeah, I was glued to this for the 10 hours or so we played it.
Yeah, the pacing was really good. The first death that you see after you see the tutorial where you see how the captain died is the first real big kraken. So sorry, that was a spoiler, but you see the pictures.
You see it pretty quickly. Yeah.
So it kind of goes from the biggest mythological creature to the least, as you see the story kind of unfurl from back to front.
Yeah. And the player does get booted from these memories just a minute after seeing each of them the first time they go, which really encourages the player to go, see a moment in time, take some notes down their journal, look at the new information they've gleaned and see if they can solve the identities of any crew members, and then if they still need more information, they can go back into that vision again and do a more detailed dive into it.
So where Assassin's Creed is a large, epic game where you can spend hours and hours and hours playing it, this one was designed to be played in a short period of time. And I think there's a really interesting design element to that.
Yeah. And then this obscure little indie something or other.
So we could have done an entire panel on Monkey Island and all of the games, so we just pulled the first one because if you don't know it, this is the one you should pick up first. It's The Secret of Monkey Island, where young Guybrush Threepwood arrives on Melee Island aspiring to become a pirate. And it's a LucasArts point-and-click adventure game from 1990. He must complete trials assigned to him from the pirate leaders, and Along the way, Governor Elaine Marley is kidnapped, and he travels to Monkey Island to rescue her from the ghost pirate LeChuck. And getting to play as a novice character is really important because it's a different take on the normal, like, swashbuckling, devious pirate as a hero game. He's kind of just like a novice as you are as the player. So it's kind of like you're stepping into him until you succeed through a combination of heart and luck.
Yeah. And like Sid Meier's Pirates, which you also mentioned, this is another one game that's really foundational for its genre. It establishes a lot of important mechanical premises. You have the ability to hover over objects with your cursor in this game and get a description, a little text caption. It really lets you see what parts of the screen are interactable, which is a huge deal. If you've ever played point and clicks like earlier titles, you don't know what on the screen you can interact with, and there's a lot of hunt and peck. And this gives you the opportunity to find stuff and solve stuff more easily. It also establishes a lot of the comedy and puzzle logic templates that are followed by numerous developers that work for these companies and others. Characters from other games like Loom, Sam and Max also make appearances. References are made to properties like Indiana Jones and Star Wars. There's a lot of topical references to previous LucasArts games, but there's also references to real people. Carla the Swordmaster is based on Carla from product support at the company at the time, and Stan is loosely based off this local car salesman, Cal Worthington, who was popular in Southern California at the time.
There's a lot of acts of piracy in Monkey Island, but they're all kind of taken with a twist. The player must train in the art of sword fight by learning various combinations of insults and comebacks. You find buried treasure by following a map that reads as dance instructions, and you navigate a ship by preparing voodoo recipes in a cauldron in the ship's galleon. It's a special game, and it's had a lot of additions done after the fact, has a lot of, with updated graphics and voice acting. There's multiple sequels to it. I recommend the Telltale series if you want to check those out. Most recently, they've done Return to Monkey Island by Terrible Toy Box. So that's also near and dear to my heart. It's among the most referenced and cultural touchstone games in history, and it's made Easter eggs in everything from Witcher 3 and Uncharted 4 to Borderlands 2 and Sea of Thieves.
And if you enjoy some pirate narrative in your game, some other narrative-rich games you can play are things like Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire, Ghost Pirates of Vuju Island, and of course the reimagining Return to Monkey Island. And that takes us to a quick games on the horizon, some stuff that's coming out you should watch for here this year and beyond. Skull and Bones, which is an open world action game based on a multiplayer expansion for Black Flag that got canceled. Frigado, Shadows of the Caribbean, which is a real-time tactics game where a small band of pirates have to use stealth and cunning. The Corsair's Legacy RPG, which is just like a Sea Dog style game. And then Tortuga, A Pirate's Tale, which is customizing a fleet of ships in turn-based combat. And we've got about 3 minutes.
Whew.
So I think what we should probably do is thank everybody for being here and take our Q&A outside because they were asking us to clear the room. But real quick, if you ever want to reach us beyond today, you can always reach us, info@winterion.com. We're very responsive online. Watch.winterion.com has all of our panel lectures from the last 7 years or so, as well as our Let's Play series, Ion Gaming, which is about 600 and change episodes in.
Or catch us on Twitter.
And we're both pretty active online. And thank you all so much for coming out here. We really appreciate it.
2 minutes.